My name is Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. And I want to thank some organizers of today's event, Dr. Kate Seaman, the Assistant Director for the Bahá'í Chair of World Peace in the back. And there's our student intern, Catherine Obasessian, back there on the table. And then at the back table from the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, we have Allison Siegel, who is an ambassador, a BSOS ambassador they're called. So thank you very much for your assistance today. As you may know, the Bahá'í Chair promotes the vision for world peace through an intensive learning process focused on how to remove the obstacles or barriers to peace, and more importantly, to explore solutions to those barriers. Today's lecture fits that vision very well because it is really central to constructing a more peaceful world. And I think that you will find the topic extremely relevant to how we can create a society in which every person is treated with respect and dignity. And of course, the lecture is concerned with the elimination of violence, which is another very important factor, which unfortunately we seem to be seeing an increasing rise in rather than a decline. And of course, this impacts the overall health of especially children, women, and of course men. I'm sure Dr. Roy will do a fabulous job of covering the details of this topic, but for us it's just extremely important for us to understand more about why is it that human beings who are capable of doing so many good things in the world sometimes end up bringing about such negative, violent, and not so good dimension to human existence. So Dr. Roy is an associate professor of family science in the University of Maryland's College of School of Public Health. His research focuses on the life course of young men, on the margins of families and work. Dr. Roy explores the intersection of health disparities, especially trauma, masculinities, and policies such as welfare reform, immigration, and incarceration. Dr. Roy has published over 60 articles and chapters, as well as a co-authored book, Nurturing Dads: Social Initiatives for Contemporary Fathering. He received his PhD in Human Development and Social Policy at Northwestern University in 1999. The title of his talk today is Man Up: Toxic Masculinities and the Health of Men, Women, and Children. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Roy.
Well, thank you so much. Should I use both mics? Just this one?
And you're okay?
As long as I speak. Okay, here we go. I can speak loud, so thank you so much, particularly to Hoda and Kate, for this invitation. And it's such an honor to be asked to be part of this series, which is so important for our campus. And I've attended a number during the years, and so to be invited to take part in this is just fantastic. Thank you to all of you again for trudging out through the first really cold day we have, and hopefully it won't get too dark by the time we finish up. So to students and department colleagues, my son's here, which is great, and I have to say the big drama of the day was hearing from my younger son if he got onto the middle school basketball team. The tryouts were held this weekend, and so we heard that he did. So Owen Gabe's on the basketball team, which is so important. Yeah, that was really the drama for today. So, I'm excited to give this talk. I teach an I-Series course called Man Up, and so for those of you who are from the I-Series course, you probably kind of roll your eyes and think, I've heard this before, but hopefully there'll be some new things for you. I should mention that it is kind of a turn for my own work. I've been an academic for about 25 years, and I come as kind of an unabashedly interdisciplinary scholar. So I'm pulling things from lots of different disciplines to put this talk together. But being part of a school of public health, I've got one foot rooted in public health. I also am kind of a qualitative methodologist, so I do most of my work based in communities. And my theoretical stance is more from a life course perspective. So I'm really looking at people's lives in the communities they live in. And I've been working with young men and fathers for a long time. And so I've been very open and trying to understand the changes in men's roles vis-a-vis fathering and work, what have you. But I think there's a growing sense of crisis in the country right now, in our communities, around masculinity. And it's something that I think is qualitatively different than what we've seen in past. And so one of the questions when we talk about what's the crisis now, what's going on, one is the crisis the reaction to the Gillette ad, which was all about confronting hegemonic masculinity and the pushback on that? Or is the crisis actually the Me Too movement and the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh and all the debate that surrounded? Is it a crisis around the fact that there are so many dads who are absent from their kids' lives or in and out of their kids' lives? Or is the crisis the fact that there are trans dads at all? And that's an issue, and people feel threatened as if that's an important crisis moment. Is the crisis the fact that Pharrell is on the cover of GQ in what looks to be a gown, talking about a new masculinity, right? Or is it the rise of white supremacy in the past number of years, right? If we think about all these moments of crisis, the question is, what is this crisis of masculinity? We've been actually talking about it for over 100 years. There's always a crisis of masculinity going on, and that's an important part of what I'm going to talk about. But who exactly is in crisis? And what is toxic about masculinity? Who is it toxic for? These are important questions. I'm going to read you a quote just to give you a sense of what toxic masculinity might feel like. This is an interview with Al. He's a 52-year-old father, divorced father of 3. And this is from a book by Michael Kimmel called Angry White Men that he wrote about 6 years ago. And Al said, look, if I did it right, I did everything they asked of me, I'd be okay, Play ball and you get rich, you'll get laid. And I did, man. For 30 years, I've been such a good soldier. And now these new laws about sexual harassment, about affirmative action, and now you're telling me, sorry, but you aren't going to get all those rewards? Is that what you're telling me? Jesus, I wouldn't have done it if I'd known I wasn't going to get those goodies. How can you just take it away from us? We've earned it. We paid our dues. We did everything you told us, and now you're saying we're not getting the big payoff. And they are. Are you kidding me? And now we're the enemy. We're getting royally screwed, guys. Seriously, I would have never have said, sign me up, if I knew it wasn't going to get to reap the same benefits as my father and my grandfather did. It all seems so unfair. So whose health is at risk? If we listen to the president says it's a dangerous time to be a young man in the United States these days. And he said this during the Brett Kavanaugh nomination, the fact that white men, in particular young white men, could be identified as perpetuating sexual assault at a younger age and just ruin their careers, right? But when we look at other folks who are impacted, and I'm thinking about the Women's March in the week following the election of Donald Trump, we realize that toxic masculinity affects a lot of people's health, and not just necessarily the young men that he identifies. I put together a timeline of the last 5 or 6 years, and because things are moving so fast in the country these days and things pile up, we forget what happened yesterday. And what I want to show you very quickly is a number of events that seem to be unrelated, but really have kind of a thread or a core of toxic masculinity kind of embedded in them. And we don't have to go back very far. If we go back to Black Lives Matter and the Ferguson shootings of Michael Brown in 2014 and the movement that created, if we think about the opioids epidemic and the deaths of despair, which I'll talk about in a little bit, particularly for middle class white men in rural communities, the whole range of shootings that have taken place. One of the first ones was the incel shooting of the involuntary celibate young man who hunted down women on a college campus in California. The election of Donald Trump and the Women's March in 2016. That same year, building the wall, deportation and family separation. The Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016. The death of Lieutenant Richard Collins III here on campus in 2017 of what appears to be a hate crime. Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that same summer, right? The rise of the right and white supremacy and the death of protesters of that, a protester in that rally. 2017, the Me Too movement, accusations of Harvey Weinstein, as well as Brett Kavanaugh. The Parkland shooting the very next year in the March for Our Lives. The death of Jordan McNair here on campus, again, as part of kind of what some people would argue to be a heavily masculine culture of athletics and what that means. And then finally, in the past few years, Christchurch and the Tree of Life Synagogue shootings, all targeted at folks who were considered to be others and in need of eradication. So clearly there's a sense of crisis, and what I'm trying to do with this lecture is thread through kind of the ways that toxic masculinity informs all of those events. So what I'm hoping to do, and the goals of this, are to define and problematize a whole range of popular and disciplinary frameworks on masculinity. I want to try to peel back and identify all these layers of masculinity, whether it's historical, individual, structural, looking at context, and then really linking men's perceptions and their behaviors to the health of women and other men and families, and to the men themselves. So here's how I want to organize the talk over the next 45 minutes or so. First, I want to quickly define what toxic masculinity is and what it isn't. We're going to talk about three specific threats to that notion of masculinity. One is a threat to hegemonic masculinity, or kind of traditional masculinity as we know it. And these are threats in particular that men who tend to be kind of white men will perceive those threats, and that their reactions to could endanger the health and well-being of women as well as men themselves. Threats to whiteness, which a lot of ways are very synonymous with threats to masculinity. And so we'll look at the reactions of men that endanger men of color in particular. And then threats to heteronormativity and cisnormativity. So again, threats to masculinity that endanger the health and well-being of LGBTQ individuals in this country. And finally, talk a little bit about detoxifying masculinity, and I'm hoping that's part of a discussion we might have, because definitely we all need to think about what some of the solutions might be and the answers. So first, for defining toxic masculinity, I want to play a clip to get you going on this. This is from a fantastic documentary called The Mask You Live In, and it's just the first few minutes of it, so bear with me as the credits roll, but I think I want to give you a sense of some young people as well as some older people talking about what toxic masculinity is.
My earliest memory was my father bringing me down to my mother's basement, putting up his hands and teaching me how to throw jabs and punches. I was there that he gave me those three words: be a man. Stop with the tears, stop with the emotions. If you're gonna be a man in this world and circumstances. That was the source of tremendous shame. I left that room with tears coming down my eyes, just feeling I wasn't quite man enough. Football became a tremendous place to hide. You can hide inside that helmet. You get to project this facade, this persona, the epitome of what it means to be a man in this culture. I thought if I could manifest as a hyper masculinity, well, somehow that would validate who and what I was. Certainly my father would respect that, to see how powerful, how strong, how tough I was, then give me the love and attention that I desperately wanted. I'd ask every man to think about what age they were, what was the context when someone told you to be a man. That's one of the most destructive phrases in this culture, I believe.
Stop crying.
Don't cry.
Stop with the emotions.
Pick yourself up.
Don't be a chump.
Don't be a pussy.
Don't let nobody disrespect you.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth shut.
Nobody likes a tattletale.
What a fag.
You little bitch.
Let your woman run your life.
Bros come before hoes. Get laid.
Be a man. Be a man.
Grow some balls. So man up.
Man up.
Man up. Man up. Grow some fucking balls.
Act like a man.
Be a man.
Yet again, another teen has taken his own life after being bullied for years.
The details of the gang rape that took place outside a high school homecoming dance are horrifying.
3 teens confessed to shooting an Australian man for, quote, the fun of it.
13 people were charged in the beating death of a Florida A&M drum major, the result of a band initiation ritual.
A student was found dead, alcohol 5 times the legal limit in his system.
He killed his girlfriend and then shot himself.
Over 20 little children dead. He also shot his mother.
The shooting was apparently premeditated. One gunman, and he is among the dead.
315 and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. Somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
If you really knew me, you would know I feel like an outsider at school.
When I'm having a bad day, sometimes it's hard to talk to somebody about it. If you really knew me, you would know that when I'm sad, I really don't say anything about it.
I used to hide emotions. Like, when I'm sad, I wouldn't tell anybody. And when I'm mad, I wouldn't tell.
For a long time, I didn't have any friends, so I didn't have anyone to talk to.
We don't really talk about feelings or nothing in our house.
If you really knew me, you know that sometimes I feel like I can't be myself.
If you really knew me, you would know that I don't really know my dad.
If you really knew me, you would know that my dad, he in jail, and I don't think I ever seen him out of jail.
Around 5th grade, my mother passed away. Most people don't know that about me.
If you really knew me, you would know that my mom and dad fought over me.
My parents went through a little phase where they told us they were going to get a divorce. I just needed someone to talk to about it.
My mom didn't have no good boyfriends. We were abused. I felt like just giving up on life.
I got bullied in 6th grade.
I felt like an outcast.
I felt alone for a long time.
So I like to start with that because I think I can read off slides all day long, but some of that conveys the gravity of kind of what we're talking about. So, toxic masculinity was coined as a term by the mythopoetic movement in the 1980s. These are poets like Robert Bly, who were really concerned with these kind of very negative aspects of masculinity because they were encouraging men to be men and kind of talk about the father wound and all of this and beating drums and sweat lodges and what have you. And so they coined that term, and it's really kind of floated through our popular media for a while. But it's really kind of grown to something quite different. In 2018, as I mentioned in the script for this talk, the word toxic was selected by Oxford Dictionary as the International Word of the Year, right? Which really reflects toxic relationships, but really toxic masculinity in particular. So what is toxic masculinity? What is it not? I would say toxic masculinity as a concept is very much, it's a popular phrase, it's important in social media. It reflects the traditional cultural norms that can be harmful to men, women, and society overall. It was not intended to demonize all men. It was not to say that all men are toxic and that everything masculine is toxic as well, right? It was to emphasize the fact that our efforts to conform to some ideals that we have, like dominance and self-reliance and competition that are normative, kind of the way they are, have health effects, and that they're toxic, right? They can be toxic. Now, the pushback on this has been, I'm not toxic, you're saying all men are toxic, right? And so one of the Facebook posts we had from the flooding in Houston from a few years ago, I used in class, was this notion that, here we have women cradling and protecting a child, and man carries and protects them both. That's how it ought to be, despite, what your gender studies professor tells you, right? As if, how can this be toxic, right? And I think most of us would agree, there's nothing toxic here necessarily. These are people who are trying to survive and care for each other, right? One would hope. I think a more productive way of thinking about toxic masculinity is to look at some of the research we've done. So from psychology in particular, there's a theory that has taken on a lot of import these days, and it's called precarious manhood theory. It's been around for about 10 years by Boston and Mandela. And they basically say, look, when men's sense of masculinity is threatened, they overcompensate. They choose things that are in their toolbox, things that they've been brought up to believe they do well and they should do well. Anger, violence, and other behaviors that impact the health of women and children and the men themselves, right? So they've done a number of experiments and research looking at this threat to masculinity and then men's reaction to that, and find that masculinity is fragile and it's precarious, and this kind of determines a lot of and predicts a lot of men's reactions to what they're faced with, right? So first thing I want to focus on is threats to hegemonic masculinity, and I want to show you another clip. Some of you may have seen this already. This is the Gillette ad that caused a lot of debate about 1.5 years ago, where you actually had a grooming, a razor company come out and put this very progressive, provocative ad on that questioned what they'd said for decades. The best a man can be, right? Which was always, shave your face, have a smooth shave, and then women will love you, basically, is what it came down to. Here's what they came out with about 1 year or so ago.
Bullying.
The Me Too movement against sexual
Toxic
harassment.
masculinity.
Is this the best a man can get? Is it? We can't hide from it.
Sexual harassment is taking over.
It's been going on far too long. We can't laugh it off.
Who's the daddy?
What I actually think she's trying to say.
Making the same old excuses.
Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys.
But something finally changed.
Allegations regarding sexual assault and sexual harassment.
But she says
And there will be no going back. Because we believe in the best in men.
Smile, sweetie. Come on.
To say the right thing. To act the right way.
Bro, not cool, not cool.
Some already are. In ways big
Yo, men,
and small.
I am strong.
I am strong.
But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay? Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
So what's interesting is the pushback that commercial got from all over. Men saw it as a threat to them. Why would you break up? This is the way boys are. They fight. Let them fight it out, right? Why would you step in and confront a friend of yours about his behavior? You're supposed to just kind of keep silent and let it happen. So a lot of the pushback from this one advertisement was particularly stunning. If you read the comments, particularly online, it got pretty bad. So what this ad challenged was a sense of hegemonic masculinity. And here I shift to sociology to kind of get this term. So sociology adds kind of a larger structural, more social component to what masculinity is. It's not just necessarily men's perceptions and kind of individual traits, but what we're looking at is a whole systemic notion of how we organize society. And Raewyn Connell kind of defined it best. She wrote about hegemonic masculinity being the idealized and culturally dominant configuration of practice that legitimizes men's dominant position in society and justifies the subordination of women and other marginalized ways of being a man, right? So it's really kind of a reflection of the real man, quote unquote, which typically, this typical man is white, middle class, heterosexual, right? It falls along the line of a sexual identity in that men play one function, women play another. You need a biological father to raise a son to show him how to be a man. And if not, then he risks being feminized by his mother, or a huge risk of becoming homosexual, right? So this was something that was a theory that was alive and well in psychology and sociology for decades in the past century, right? Hegemonic masculinity also means the loss of the relational. So as boys have close friendships and deep secrets with each other growing up, they learn to stand on their own 2 feet, be a man, be individual. You don't need anyone else. You might need a partner who's going to help you out, but that's going to be a woman. And that sense of friendship and close relationships is something that is not prioritized, right? Emotional suppression. Again, simply don't cry, right? That sense that men shouldn't express too much emotion, they should suppress it. And if anything, if they show an emotion that's okay, it's anger. So there's kind of one channel for men's emotional expression. And hegemonic masculinity is not just about kind of force, kind of setting this situation, this system through the use of force, but a lot of it is very coercive through institutions and our culture. It's very nuanced. And so it's complex and complicated the way this kind of all plays out. But it provides a justification for why men are in the dominant position they are, and it includes a way to kind of socialize kids to kind of buy into this as well, right? And here's a whole list of different kind of attributes that are usually associated with hegemonic masculinity. Some of them, things that are negative, clearly. Some are things that we feel pretty good about. Courage, independence, responsibility. I mean, these are things that can be important, affirming parts and positive parts, potentially, of hegemonic masculinity. But as boys are socialized through adolescence and into young adulthood, into masculinity, all these kind of, these important parts of hegemony play out, and they don't play out in the healthiest ways. So what we find is that when we do research with young men who are learning to suppress their emotions, they are unable to identify even how they're feeling. They can't express themselves to others, much less themselves, right? If they rely on a sense of sexual identity, then everything is essentialized between, what is masculine and what is feminine. And really, if something is feminine, then it can't be masculine. So masculinity is kind of, by definition, the absence of femininity. And then finally, this loss of the relational. As they shed a lot of those important relationships, they find themselves in a crisis of connection. As that one young man said, I felt really alone for a long time. I feel isolated, right? And no way to kind of get back and have a sense of how to connect. Michael Kimmel wrote about this in the book Guyland. He's a sociologist up in Stony Brook. And he wrote about Guyland, and he said, particularly campus culture, he did a lot of work with college-age men, and said there are kind of 3 pillars of this sense of Guyland on campus, which is a sense of young men's entitlement, but without having any power. The silence in the face of men's violence, right? So again, we're not going to say anything if my friend does something in ways of sexual harassment or sexual assault. We keep quiet about that. And then if there is a threat to one of us, it's bros before hoes. You circle around and you protect, right, other men. And there's also a sense of mandatory heteronormativity. So that the expression no homo kind of comes up again and again for young men kind of wanting to express their masculinity in a certain way. So I like the quote John Legend, the musician, has about this, about policing. He says, I think you're always policing yourself and trying to think, when you're trying to do what you think would be cool and accepted by other people, until you start to figure out who you really want to be. Growing up is an ongoing push and pull of being yourself and you performing to what society expects you to be. I think the end product ends up being some kind of composite of these two. But that policing part is important when it comes to masculinity in particular. Unfortunately, this is an ideal. Unfortunately, the reality is it has to be an ideal. These are kind of ideal standards that supposedly men are trying to live up to. But really for decades and decades, people have pointed to the fact that this is fragile, that this is something men have to achieve, but oftentimes men don't. In fact, the majority of men never become masculine in the ways that everyone would expect. So it's risky, it's failure prone. It's become more so over time. So since the late 70s, for example, for 40 years or more, men's wages, being the breadwinner, kind of the provider, but men's wages have flattened and declined. And so more and more men are at risk for not being able to play that part, that important part of the hegemonic ideal, right? Joe Pleck, who was a family scientist, and so I'll kind of claim him as kind of one of our own, in the 1980s was one of the first psychologists to look at men who wanted to try to violate those traditional roles, felt that they couldn't challenge them because there was what he called sex role strain. They felt inadequacy and insecurity by actually confronting these ideals. They couldn't even step up and kind of do things differently as a man. We now know, 30 years later after Pleck, that the APA came out, the American Psychological Association came out with a huge report last year which said that traditional masculinity, through a decade of research, is shown to have detrimental aspects for men and boys, in particular related to aggression, violence, and oppression, right? Again, huge pushback on this policy, right? Saying that all this is just toxic masculinity, this is all men being toxic. Michael Kimmel framed it in a different way, in a way that I think is really interesting. He talked about aggrieved entitlement. And he basically said that where we're at now is that a number of men are losing their sense of entitlement, that sense of privilege that they had, and they're upset, right? Part of it is demographic change in our country. As we change into a majority-minority society, it's threatening to white men in particular. And so that concern and anxiety they're experiencing is transformed into anger, and that anger is legitimized by social media, by politicians, and then you get expressions that we haven't seen maybe in decades here in this country. So I want to explore a couple ways that this affects the health of women and men themselves. Limited communications that men may bring to relationships and the inability to kind of sustain close relationships might mean that men rely heavily on women to do the emotional labor in a relationship. So there was an article that came out in Harper's in the spring, talked about men being emotional gold diggers, right? So at midlife, they rely on their wives to help them understand what they're feeling, what they're going through. Because they don't have a network of friends to rely on to help them process these things, they don't have names for what they're feeling, but they rely heavily on their wives. And what women are doing is feeling quite exhausted by doing most of the emotional labor, not just for their children and the family, but the men as well. Some of the emergent anger and anxiety that men face has been targeted at women. The fathers' rights movement was a big piece of this throughout the 1980s. So as divorce grew, particularly in middle-class white families, a lot of the confusion and grief around the breakup was targeted at a whole movement for men that was aimed at wives and judges and feminists, kind of taking the heat for the loss of privilege that men felt in families. And what's happened over the past 30 years is a lot of that anger has been transferred onto the net. And so we have the manosphere, which is online kind of harassment, and it's a gathering place for men who feel this anxiety and this anger and targeting at women in particular, harassment of women online, and a whole range of different blogs and types of interaction. Then clearly we have kind of in the recent years, directions to move for more control over women's health and contraception. And I would not be wrong saying a lot of these efforts were led by white men, particularly men who felt threatened, their masculinity was threatened. The rejection of women's health care services as a basic element of health care access, okay? If you watch that debate online and you see the lawmakers, a woman trying to stand up for this being a basic component of health care and a white man saying, no, it's not, right, to her face. The recent abortion ban in Georgia and efforts to undo Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court, right? And here's the signature of now Governor of Atlanta, Brian Kemp, or Governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp. And the reaction of women drawing from the imagery of Handmaid's Tale, right? Clearly, the effect of hegemonic masculinity on violence towards women in terms of sexual harassment and assault is important. Part of what's at the heart of this is trying to understand how boys and men fuse sexuality and their sex drive with a capacity for intimate, compassionate relationships, and how complicated that can be when you don't have the tools necessarily, the expectations to be able to do that, right? So we know that sexual harassment is more common for men who have limited emotional expressions, right? So we've done there's a project in Australia called the Man Project Box where they said, 7 times the rate of men expressed harassment of unknown strangers if they had fairly limited emotional expression as compared to men who had kind of a full range of emotional expression. We've investigated interpersonal violence in a whole range of ways that plays out within partnerships. But we know a lot of the patterns and facts, and they're pretty clear. So the instance of rape, the experience of rape is expansive. It's extensive for women as opposed to the experience of men. We know here on campus, in terms of sexual assault, it's a little bit closer, but 1 in 5 women experience sexual assault as opposed to 1 in 16 men. It's a completely different experience for women here on campus. Over the course of their lives, women are 91% of sexual assault victims are women and 9% are men. So how is this related to masculinity? There's actually been a lot of research done that shows clear association. We use these measures of masculinity, and we're able to associate that with the importance of status and toughness and anti-femininity and expressions of anger for men. So there have been multiple studies done over this over the past 2 decades. We know that masculinity threats to men's masculinity leads to increased anger and greater desire for social dominance over women. We also know that in terms of anger and violence, that men have kind of they confront a different type of disorder, what's called intermittent explosive disorder. This kind of snapping that happens when someone explodes in anger is about twice as common as it is for men. That about 10 million men in this country face that kind of, it's extreme anger and violence, kind of at the spur of the moment. But it's much more common in men than it is among women. This spills over into not just relationships, but kind of other expressions of violence that affect women, but men in communities as well. One obvious one that I pointed to earlier is gun violence. To the extent that gun possession is a confirmation of your masculinity, it's not a stretch to say that. In fact, our advertisers even say so. So this is an advertisement by Bushmaster Rifles. A Bushmaster rifle was used in the Sandy Hook shooting, and this came out about the same time as this advertisement, which says, "Consider your man card reissued." So the sense that if you're going to show that you're a verified member of the man group, whatever that is, right, here's your card. You've got your rifle, right? 3 times more men own guns than women, and women are much more likely to vote for gun bans. And in particular, the study of mass shootings in the US and the uptick of them in recent years shows that the large majority tend to be white men. But in particular, they're expressing some kind of aggrievement, some kind of threat to their masculinity, whether it was from a former partner, a former coworker, someone who dissed them, someone who in the community is just offensive to them by their existence because they're a different color or different nationality or different religion, right? James Gilligan from the Center for the Study of Violence says, "I've yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed or humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed, and did not represent the attempt to prevent or undo that loss of face, no matter how severe the punishment, even if it includes death." So I would include a lot of his understanding of violence linked to hegemonic masculinity as well. Another expression of violence that we experience here on campus is sports, and around the country and around the world, to be honest. So sports is a contested ground for gender, and we're beginning to recognize more what the costs of that could be, as well as maybe healthier ways to play sports, right? So it's no mistake that we suddenly have an uptick in research around concussions and what the cost of concussions, over 135,000 sports-related concussions, mostly in football. The understanding of the culture of date rape, particularly on college campuses, and as that's related to the athletic culture as well, right? We know that from studies that participation in organized sports is associated with bullying, sexual violence, and physical aggression. That's not to say there aren't healthy ways of doing this, but the way that we're currently doing it may not be working for the health of women and for men as well. When we think about how masculinity reflects back on men's physical health and men's mental health, it's important to kind of understand a few things. So men die of all leading causes of death at younger ages than women, except for Alzheimer's disease. Their average life expectancy is about 5 years less than women. Why might that be? Part of it is that they don't go to the doctor. They don't take care of themselves. They have less access to health care. So about 25% of men don't see a doctor in a given year, the previous year, as opposed to 8% of women. And a number of men are engaged in what is unhealthy or risky behavior that impacts their physical well-being. Much higher rates of smoking and drinking than women, more accidental deaths and serious injuries, even things like being less likely to wear seatbelts or use sunscreen, because who needs that kind of stuff, right? So because men don't need someone to tell them, how to be. And you all know, to some extent, intuitively from growing up in your families, how hard it is to get a guy to the doctor, whether it's your father or your brother or your uncle or your grandfather. Usually you need some other woman to kind of drag them by their teeth to go there. So some of this is not surprising. To the extent that that's related to masculinity, I think it's an interesting question, right? Mental health as well. We know that stressful life events lead men in particular to different forms of silence and and visibility. So Michael Addis, who's up at Amherst, does some really good work on men's mental health and this degree of personal silencing where you aren't even attuned with yourself and what's happening with you in terms of stress. Private silence where even if you know what it is, you're not going to tell someone else. And then there's also a public silencing that if you do say, I'm in trouble, I need some help, there's a sense that, hey, I don't want to hear about it. Who are you to tell me this? You're a guy, right? So there's mental health as kind of a reflection of being weak as a man, right? It's also easy and common for men to problematize women's behavior as being a mental health concern, right? So what's the difference between injuring yourself versus injuring another person, right? What's seen as more problematic? Crying or never crying at all? Needing others or never needing others, right? From a hegemonic masculine perspective, it's clear that women have some issues they need to deal with, but the way we're dealing with things are fine, right? Men are less likely to be diagnosed with depression, and I'll show you a slide in a minute to kind of explain some of that, but part of that is related to a loss of the relational, so not having those close relationships over time, but it's also an investment in rage and workaholism and coping through alcohol and drugs potentially. So this is an interesting piece on depression that I think we need to understand about men and women, is that in terms of lifetime incidence of mental health disorders, women oftentimes we see have about twice the rate of depression, more or less, that men do, right? But what we also see is that men have about twice the rate of substance abuse disorder that women have. And so our notion of what is depression, it might be that men are masking or coping with depression by investing in these pretty poor coping behaviors, right? So that by the time we come down to it, we look at both substance abuse disorder and mental health disorders, we're looking at about the same size, about 1 out of every 2 men and women have some kind of issues with this, right? And so the way we look for depression, the way it's assessed between men and women, I think is something to consider as related to what men are expected to do in dealing with depression. Over here we have there's been a whole range of studies done looking at measures of masculinity and how it relates to negative mental health or seeking psychological help. And we see clear patterns across all these studies that, high rates of what we consider hegemonic masculinity, so self-reliance, being a playboy, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, they're related very much to poor mental health, as well as really not seeking the help that we might need. To take this kind of all the way to the full extreme, When we think about situations that many men find themselves in, traditionally we have generations of men who've gone to war. And we've only since Vietnam begun to kind of put a name to what this might be. It used to be being shell-shocked, right? But now we know PTSD is something that is real, and we're beginning to understand it more and more. So we're looking at trauma and stress-related disorder when we talk about PTSD. Symptoms that men have, women as well, re-experiencing avoidance, negative alterations in cognition and mood, alterations in arousal and reactivity. It turns out that interpersonal trauma is much more related and likely to lead to PTSD. So those would be situations of sexual assault and rape, but also armed conflict, right? Because that is quite personal in so many ways. It turns out that not everyone who's exposed to combat necessarily develops PTSD. About 78% of service members, both men and women, who were exposed to combat did not develop it. And there's some interesting differences between men and women. But in general, about 9% of all men and women are likely to develop some kind of PTSD over their lifetime related to war or other interpersonal trauma. There are important differences as well for kind of homicide and suicide for men. And these are probably the most sobering statistics. The fact that men are the majority of perpetrators and victims of violence is important to consider. 90% of all homicides, 70% of all victims of homicide are men. And death rates for suicide and homicide are 4 times higher for men than women. And this holds all across the life course. So if you look at the age, under the age of 45, men and boys account for 75% of violent deaths. Men account for 75% of all traumatic brain injuries. Unintentional injuries are the leading cause of death under the age of 45, right? And men are, again, 4 times as likely to take their own lives. So a window onto this is kind of this circumstance, this kind of situation that's developed, and it's a pattern in death rates, particularly among white, non-Hispanic men and women who have high school degrees or less. So what we began to find about 6 or 7 years ago, we began to get data showing us that actually their death rates were increasing relative to almost everyone else in the United States, as well as other countries around the world. There's this uptick. And it's been termed deaths of despair. And particularly it's focused on the experiences of men. So what we're looking at is a pattern that started in Appalachia and the Deep South and has actually spread throughout the country, so no regional differences at this point in the data that we can find. But it's this sense of people's lives that are at midlife, they're between the ages of 50 and 54, right? And they've accumulated a lot of very stressful events. Marriage and employment rates falling apart. Physical pain, the pain of aging, clearly, particularly if you're not in good health to begin with. Poor physical and mental health increasing. But the way of dealing with that in some communities where there's not a lot of promise for getting a good job or making a good change in your life has been reliance on opioids. And so there's this sense that the death of despair that a lot of men, as well as women, but we're focused kind of on men's experiences with dealing with depression or not, turning to opioids and alcohol and suicide. To a rate that really stands out in the United States, but around the world is something that's of concern. What's interesting is this time this gets really hyped up and overplayed to some extent when you've had high rates of death and suicide among men of color, for example, for decades, and that we need to kind of attend to. But this is kind of white men, suddenly we kind of step up and say, well, what's going on here? There must be something wrong, right? Okay. Take a sip of water here. So, that was threats to hegemonic masculinity. Shifting a little bit, I want to talk about whiteness, and I want to talk about, in particular, threats to the health of men of color. These are 2 posters that appeared on campus here at UMD just a few years ago. They were distributed by Vanguard America, Blood and Soil, which you can go online and find this stuff very easily, right? So they were glued onto pillars around campus and onto the concrete. And you can see the appeal to white men, to white families, that the world is changing, white men need to wake up, right? So there's this kind of sense of hegemonic masculinity that does have a core element of race involved, right? Of a sense of whiteness. So to the extent that we're in a crisis of masculinity, I think we're also in a moment, a historical moment, we're in a crisis of whiteness too. This is a quote, actually, by Ruby Sales, who's a civil rights activist. The number of hate groups around the country peaked under President Obama in 2011, and it declined a little bit, but it's peaked at a higher level just last year under President Trump. The fact that white supremacy is a thing, and that young teenage boys are being recruited, and that our newspapers are printing up articles about how to protect your sons from being recruited online to white supremacist groups, shows that this is a moment where there's an organization of men's anger as bitterness and resistance and politically mobilized rage. And it plays into this kind of what D'Angelo calls a white fragility, where a lot of folks say, this isn't happening, it's not about whiteness, right? But when you look at the kind of vehemence at which we're arguing about what is whiteness, and we're not all white supremacists, or this is the way, we need to go back to our legacy, this sense of back and forthness. Clearly, we're at a very different moment historically, and I think it relates to masculinity. In part because what we're also doing is targeting for removal men of color, and we've set up kind of gender-specific racial removal programs for that. For decades, we've had a system of mass incarceration that disproportionately affects African American men, and we're putting in place a system of deportation and family separation that also targets Latino men and immigrant men, as well as women. These are enforced both outside of our borders and within our borders, so they're expansive systems. They're not just afterthoughts and kind of things that just emerge over time. And they introduce what people write about as a master status for men of color. If you are an ex-offender, if you're a deportee, if you're an illegal citizen or a non-citizen, right? These are definitions, they're statuses that guide your life, that restrict your mobility, your options, your opportunities, and your control over your life, right? Linda Burton, who was one of my mentors, wrote a couple decades ago an article called Invisible Men. And she basically said, look, one of the things we don't recognize is the relationship between white men and men of color over time, historically, and how the work and family roles of white men have really shaped and also been shaped by the work and family roles of men of color. So here she looked at the history, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, the Bracero programs of recruiting Mexican laborers, all men, after the war, the New Deal, the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, the GI Bill and how it played out differently for white men and men of color, soldiers of color, the Civil Rights Movement, Reaganomics, the Million Man March. All of these are kind of historical moments in which there was this dialogue or engagement between men across race and ethnicity that assumed kind of a hegemonic masculinity, a sense of domination of white men over men of color. But I think it's important now to also understand that hegemonic masculinity is not where we stop or where anyone really stops. If we begin to move away from one type of masculinity, we recognize there are multiple masculinities. We recognize social context and power and the ways that different men choose to practice health in kind of contradictory ways sometimes, and that reflects health disparities in our communities. So we begin to take more of an intersectional approach and say, how does masculinity look as it varies by race and ethnicity particularly, right? And in particular for men who resist hegemonic masculinity and say, I don't want to be kind of the white middle-class heteronormative guy. And there are valid ways of being men, right? I can be a macho, I can be an elder in the Rastafarian culture, okay? I can be a strong member of a gang potentially that spans borders, right? So there are ways of being a man that don't look like being a Wall Street broker or banker or something, and that's important to think about, particularly when you study masculinities, right, and how it relates to kind of that hegemonic masculinity piece. What that's meant is, in public health, is a really exciting kind of development, which is this emergence of kind of a new field of what's called men's health equity. And this is a new book that's come out in the past year from a network of young scholars of color in particular, that recognize, and they say, well, when we look at the social, both the health and the social causes of morbidity and mortality for, let's say, for black men in particular, we usually look at public health problems like violence, prostate cancer, HIV, AIDS, and social determinants of health, education, gender socialization. But what we're missing a lot is we're looking at causes of death and other types of things, but what we're missing is the effect of discrimination, segregation, access to health care, employment, income, right? So we need an intersectional approach to also understand how power works and how systems work, systems that are constructed primarily by white men, okay, to maintain privilege, and how that affects the health of men of color in particular. So in confronting racism and discrimination, right, we can kind of encourage healthy lifestyle changes in behavior for folks who are experiencing those things. But that's not going to change long-standing social and historical conditions of inequality, right? So how do we change institutional racism? Not just through, someone deciding to, not commit a crime or take a job somewhere else or something. We're really looking at the process by which we assign values and privilege and opportunity based on skin color, right? Or cultural background. So to me, this is best illustrated in part from Between the World and Me and by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he wrote a section, this is a book he's written for his son, and he's talking about the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson. And he says, growing up in Baltimore, fear ruled everything around me. And I knew, as all black people do, that this fear was connected to the dream, what he calls the dream, kind of like the American dream. To the unworried boys, to pie and pot roast, to the white fences and green lawns nightly beamed into our television sets. And then he talks to his son and he says he explains why he didn't console his son, who was very distraught about the death of Michael Brown and the fact that the jury was acquitted in his death. He says, I didn't tell you it would be okay because I never believed it would be okay. I'm sorry I can't make it okay. I'm sorry I can't save you. The struggle is really all I have for you because it's the only portion of this world under your control, right? And so thinking about, as a father of color, as a black man in the society, talking to the black man that you're raising, right? The perspective is quite different when you think about masculinity and how you are performing as a man, right? I want to give you a couple of quotes from some of the research we've done with young men in Baltimore, who talk about this sense of stress and living under discrimination and racism and violence in their communities. Young one, who's a young man in Baltimore, 19 years old, said, my greatest fear is falling off. And we were kind of like, and he said, you don't get it? Off of life, falling off. I mean, basically just falling off for real. Like, how the junkies and the little homeless people just be. That's falling off of life, and that's where I get falling from, just falling. I ain't trying to fall like that, and that falling off's hard for real. No home, no house, nothing. You feel me? A bum. I'm not trying to be a bum. So that's a good term that I came up with right now. So that's falling for real. Or Fry, who's also lived on the east side of Baltimore, he said stress. Stress was one of the reasons I got put into the system. Meaning locked up in incarceration. I keep getting in trouble, keep getting locked up, and when I get locked up, they question you about where you live, and I don't have nowhere I can say that I lived. My mother didn't have no house to go to. She was staying with different people. We were staying with different people. My little brother would stay somewhere. My sister would go her way. My mother would stay somewhere. It's really difficult. It's just stress. That's what we call ourselves. That's why we rep stressed out. You can't put it no simpler, self-explanatory than that. If I had hair, you'd see gray hair in my head. I've done seen it all. There's no type of way to go back to my family. I'm stressed out all the time. So how do we understand that? Part of it is we look at men's exposure to violence in their communities. And so we've done studies of homicide survivorship in Baltimore. So this is Jocelyn Smith-Lee, who's a former doctoral student here in School of Public Health, and she's now a faculty member down at UNC Greensboro. And she points out that homicide is the leading cause of death for black males aged 10 to 24, and the rates of homicide rates are dramatically different for young black men as compared to Latino or white men. And she sees homicide survivorship as a health disparity. And it has consequences that are health related: PTSD, anxiety and depression, substance use, emotional reactivity, hindered ability to function. We look at ways that trauma plays out that is complex, having multiple experiences of exposure to violence, not just once or twice witnessing the death of a friend or family member, but 3 or 4 or 5 times when you're 6 and when you're 12 and when you're 15, right? And you carry that with you and it accumulates and it's not resolved, that trauma that you carry with you. What's the effect over time? What she points to is hypervigilance among these young men. They say they're on point all the time. It's that stressed out feeling. And she also says there's no post, meaning there's no getting past it. It's always there every day you walk out your door. It's not something you can kind of move beyond. One young man she interviewed in Baltimore is named Julius. He said, it changed a lot of things, the murder of his cousin. I just started caring less about childhood stuff, like playing football and all that. It made me grow up a little faster too. Watch for stuff I'm not even supposed to be watching out for, like stray bullets and all types of stuff. When no child should be worrying about stuff like that, you know? Should nobody be worried about that? It messed me up. Even though I knew about people getting killed and stuff, it didn't click with me yet. His murder messed me up. No more playing football, no more riding bikes, stuff and all that. Just little child stuff. I didn't care too much about that anymore. So what we look at is ways that men begin to cope or try to cope with this experience of living in communities where they're under stress because of racism and discrimination and exposure to violence, right? We're looking at patterns of men who we call they're ghosting. And it basically means men who, when they become young adults, they find safe places away from families and friends to be isolated, but they're safe. And they do identity work at the same age as you all are all here in college doing your identity work, going to class, thinking about what's your next step. There are young men who are staying with friends of friends of friends, couch surfing, staying in 2 or 3 places in one week, thinking about what's my place in society, where do I go next, right? Same kinds of identity issues. A lot of them are dealing with histories of incarceration. And then when they come out from being incarcerated and they come in for reentry, being ineligible because of being ex-offenders for health care, for welfare, to be able to vote, to find a job, right? They're also dealing with what Victor Rios, a sociologist out in Riverside, calls the youth control complex. So this is something that's set up in communities for young men of color, criminalizing and policing boys, and then infusing all of their interactions with businesses, with housing, with schools, with community centers, right? It's a pipeline from school to prison, basically, is what we're creating, right? And the way that young boys are reacting to that is resisting and proving their manhood by acting out. And again, not acting white, not necessarily acting lawful, because this is a way of resisting kind of that whole youth control complex. John Rich, who's a physician up at Drexel, has a really nice way of framing this, and particularly for he's focused on young black men who've been injured, but I think the same goes for young Latino boys as well. He said, if we think about these young men as being sick or being violent, what we're doing is we're locating the problem within them. And so we come up with solutions like we'll create an institution like incarceration, or we'll create an intervention, a mental health intervention, to kind of bring it to them and change them and make them better, or at least kind of manage them. But he said that the focus might want to be the toxic environments we've created for these young people to grow up in, right? So the question might be, who harmed you? And what we can do, in effect, is change the environment to allow young men in particular to heal and correct themselves in ways that do work, in ways that they feel are resilient and that they can cope. For young Latino men, kind of on the flip, we're looking at their experiences of deportation and family separation through the migration process, a sense of legal liminality, where they're kind of not quite here as citizens, they're kind of, but also not back at home, particularly if they're in the midst of migration. The trauma of that migration process is clear, and I'll read a quote for you in just a minute. But we're really looking at kind of the targeted deportation of Latino men. In the early days, I think a lot of it's switching over now to a number of women being targeted for deportation as well. But family separation and confinement for young Latino men at the border, disproportionately the young people who are confined at the border are young men kind of late teens, early 20s, right? And it's not a surprise a lot of this is happening at the same time the political rhetoric was amped up, right? Where we had 3 years ago a presidential candidate say, Mexico sends its people, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, right? And it begins to kind of stereotype all young Latino people who are coming in through migration. We're beginning to do some interviews with a group of Salvadoran youth who are unaccompanied minors out in Montgomery County. And this was from an interview with one of them. This was a young man who came out as gay before he left Honduras. And this is kind of a snapshot of what he's bringing as he comes into the country and his lived experience. So he said, my sexual presence, it's a reason why people die. It's one of the reasons I decided to come here to the US. I'm from the most dangerous city in the world. My mom said, I wanted you for the son what you were, not what you've decided to be now. I had to tell my dad that my sexual orientation is not the correct one. He looked at me like I was a weird bug. He does really love us, but he was a soldier, and that does not let me be open with him now with his machismo. When I was 14, I went away to school, and I lived on my own like a nomad. When I was 20, my stepdad paid $10,000 to a coyote, and I left. I was in a trailer with like 250 people, 14 hours in that truck. After we crossed the border one night, I walked for 24 hours with 27 others. He remembers all of them, how many there were, to get to another town in Texas. The immigration people found us at night, and we ran like 2 kilometers in the dark. I was one of 3 people who got through immigration without catching us. And tomorrow I have court, and they'll tell me if my political asylum case gets approved. I'm honestly not prepared to go back to my country. So how does the sense of masculinity shape his life, whether with his own father, but also the new immigration policies? So for both of these groups of men, both African-American men and Latino men that I'm talking about, we're looking at ways of coping and resilience, that they try to cope and resist kind of mainstream masculinity, but also find a way to be men in themselves, right? They're dealing with health consequences of hypermasculinity at times. They're coping sometimes through anger and substance abuse. I would say that from a public health perspective, we're looking at a sense of chronicity, which means that over time, dealing with stress at a young age and that stress never going away. It's constantly affecting your body. It's affecting your mental health. It's affecting your decisions and your life opportunities. One would hope they're developing a sense of resilience in the face of that. So here's this one in particular. These are young African-American men who are incarcerated, clearly. This is a picture of some of the detention centers that are set up around Brownsville in Texas, right outside an old Walmart, actually. And all of these folks in line are young men from primarily the northern triangle of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Okay. We are winding down. I've got one more little clip to show you, and then I will wrap things up. So the third piece of this is how hegemonic masculinity is a threat to heteronormativity and cisnormativity. This is another ad by Gillette. It was just released a few months ago, and it's called First Shave.
Growing up, I was always trying to figure out what kind of man I wanted to become, and I'm still trying to figure out what kind of man that I want to become. I always knew I was different. I didn't know that there was a term for the type of person that I was. I went into my transition just wanting to be happy. I'm glad I'm at the point where I'm able to shave. South, south, north, north, east, west, never in a hurry. Right.
War. Now don't be scared. Don't be scared. Shaving is about being confident. Oh, you're doing fine. You are doing fine.
I'm at the point in my manhood where I'm actually happy. It's not just myself transitioning, it's everybody around me transitioning.
So another reason to buy Gillette razors, right? Right, anyone can use a Gillette. This is an interesting turn for me. So when we talk about traditional masculinity and ways that it's been problematized and critiqued, given my age, I came up more kind of in the second wave of feminism. So I've understood masculinity to be kind of its relationship to feminine. And gender was very much a binary. That's the way I grew up and the way I understood kind of where I fit in life and where everyone else did. And I think what we've seen in the past 10 or 20 years, but increasingly among you folks, kind of young people, is understanding that gender is not a binary, that it's a spectrum, and that we have to really think about both assumptions we make about heteronormativity and cisnormativity. What does that mean? Heteronormativity is the assumption that people fall into distinct and complementary genders with natural roles in life. And there's been research showing that boys know what homophobia is before they even understand what sexuality is, or sexual activity, or a sexual identity. They learn this extremely early on, right? This is the no-ho guy, I guess, I don't know. Cisnormativity is related. It's the assumption that all human beings have a gender identity that matches the sex that they were assigned at birth, right? So we're talking about gay and trans individuals, and both understanding that masculinity is about embodiment. It has to be about the body, but it's also not about the body, about saying that that defines our reality as well. So it's a complicated notion. If we begin to try to understand what that is, and as individuals go through that and become who they are, think about what that means, then we begin to see that we're complicating that binary. To do that is incredibly threatening to, I would say, a lot of folks, but in particular we're focused on kind of traditional white men who aspire to that, okay? Men who aspire to a sense of heteronormativity and cisnormativity, right? So if you think about how that affects, those assumptions affect the lives of LGBTQ individuals in this country, we're looking at how do you parent, how do you partner in a heterosexist society with these institutional barriers, dealing with everyday discrimination and harassment and lack of legal protection, anti-transgender and anti-gay violence, particularly for youth who are kind of working through a lot of these issues and trying to understand who they are, unemployment, homelessness, barriers to healthcare for sure. There are some very clear policy and law implications that have constrained LGBTQ individuals. And for example, for gay and trans partners and dads, you've got DOMA, which is a very clear definition of what marriage was between a man and a woman until it was struck down by the Supreme Court, right? FMLA, which defines parental leave by sex and gender, right, specifically. Adoption restrictions that restricted adoptions for same-sex couples for decades and are kind of being lifted, have been lifted very recently. And then as we move forward on a lot of this and feel the sense of things opening up, move back to restrictions by the current administration to kind of go back to locking up a lot of the protections that we might have developed. But there's also a sense of kind of relational health effects that we get. So in terms of youth who are coming out to their families, for example, the effects of family rejection, we begin to know more about through research what are the health effects for that. That youth oftentimes compensate with high-risk behaviors, right? Substance use, for example, depression and other mental health problems. The rates of homelessness and suicide are quite high for gay and trans young youth. The psychological challenges for fathers, gay and trans fathers who are raising children, right? The fear of their kids' well-being, thinking about where we'd live, what's an appropriate living situation, schools, the unique socialization that kids may need, and then internalized stigma. They feel that, I'm not a real mom, so how do I care for my children? And don't they need that kind of thing, that essentialist message that we get? And then hovering over this is the kind of coercion to come out, the threat of conversion, reparative therapies that are out there. So there's a sense that we want to pull people back into the right alignment of gender, right? And that this is one of the ways. In fact, this just had its moment on Capitol Hill because there was a big hearing about this that one of the Congress folks decided to kind of call a hearing on conversion and reparative therapy. So it has its moments. Clearly, it's something that we're negotiating and navigating as we go. And it's clearly a battle to kind of push forward, I think, a very different challenge to those kinds of assumptions of masculinity. So wrapping up, detoxifying masculinity. Couple suggestions I have. This is not kind of, here's what we do now kind of talk at all. Clearly, one of the things we can do is groom ourselves better using man up, grooming. No, I'm just kidding. A lot of the, there's a whole range of commodification of kind of this toxic masculinity, man up stuff, whether it kind of ranges from metrosexual to hardcore, traditional manhood. But there are some really interesting things online about grooming techniques and man up and toxic masculinity. Anyway, you guys can look at that stuff yourself. Relational responses, ways to detoxify masculinity. So there have been people who've been for years talking about bystanders and playing your brother's keeper, that there's a sense that men have to be involved, and you saw some of it in the ad where a man interrupts another man in the midst of harassment, right? And even to the extent that we've written scripts, and I'm not going to read that, but there's a script for a young man to confront another one, his friend who sexually assaulted a mutual friend, right? And putting some things on the line and being very clear what the consequences are of acting this way, right? Because men oftentimes don't have words and they can't come up with this spontaneously, particularly young people who have not been put in this situation before, right? So as a way of kind of dealing with relational responses and detoxifying some of this, that's an interesting way of putting some of this forward, right? But in general, the focus would be is to help men discard harmful ideas. Focus on positive aspects of masculinity, courage, leadership, but having very flexible attitudes about gender and how gender relates to well-being, right? So part of it is being open-minded, knowing you're going to make mistakes and say wrong things, but that you're ready to learn and listen can be an important piece of this. There are also institutional responses. So it's not just relying on a change of heart or kind of talking to your best friend about this. That's important. But there are larger issues at hand, right? So we know, again, APA came out with this report on decades of research on programs and policies. And one of their recommendations was we need to encourage practitioners to offer healthier versions of masculinities, positive fathering, identity formation that encourages you to bring all pieces of who you are together, not just the fact that you can earn $1, right? But you're a caring individual, whatever. Encouraging educational systems to develop new responses to the needs of men and boys in particular. And then two examples that I use in class and I go to a lot because they're really fascinating. One is an online community for changing masculinities, and there are a number of them online. The one that I look to a lot is called the Good Man Project, and it pulls men and participants from all over the country about a number of issues: mental health, fathering, sports, I mean, you name it. And it's very open to kind of wherever you're at, you come there and you're able to kind of process some of it and read some good material. But there are also institutional responses like public health departments. The State Department of Public Health in Colorado developed a website for men's mental health, and it's called Man Therapy. I don't know if you can see this, but this is at a bus stop where it's using humor in a really engaging way. So the first one says grilling animal meat, and this one says pooping, and this one says a 7th inning stretch. And it's a way to catch, guys will pay attention to pooping, right? They'll see that and be like, what's that about? And it's a way of saying, this is the way that men meditate. And then you've got to check out this online site, of course, at that point. And they deal with some really, they deal with suicide and depression, but they do it in a way that's not so serious and heavy-handed and makes men be defensive. They're much more open in this way. But in terms of directions, what I would say is that the directions are really coming from you all. So you all have different views on to gender and masculinity than a lot of folks older than you. And I think you're the ones who are thinking about changes on campus and changes with where you're going, with your own career, with your own relationships. And I think to some extent it's up to us to continue this discussion, this critique, to push new ideas around for kind of detoxifying masculinity. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive overview of Man Up and Masculinities, and I think we better open it up to questions now. There is a microphone here and one on the side. If you could just line up, and we'll take the questions for the next about 15 or so minutes. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. So that was a great presentation, thank you. I just had a question about the slide that you had. Why were the two in yellow? At the beginning where you sort of identified all the different markers chronologically. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah,
I missed that part.
It's pretty easy. It was the PowerPoint template. I tried so hard to change it, but I couldn't. So I thought someone was going to catch this. They're going to think there's something about the Orlando shooting. He's trying to tell me, and I'm not getting it. So it was absolutely nothing. So if that was the only thing that stuck with you, then good.
I was curious because I was like, is there a relationship that I'm missing?
Right.
That's what I was trying to get at.
No, if anything, it's kind of. It's this. It was the first time I had really tried to compile a number of events that I think I relate to toxic masculinity, and I was amazed. I thought I'd have to go back to like the 1930s and show that, and I thought I have too many in the past 5 years. It took up all the little dots that I could use on the template. So, yeah, thanks.
So you talked about men's mental health and how men have significantly lower lower depression rates than women. But do you think that could be because, I'm sorry, I meant they have lower rape rates than women do. Could that be because of their emotional suppression and that they're more likely to underreport it, and there also could be stigma related around that?
Absolutely. I think not being assessed for depression, underreporting, right, that's definitely a part of it, for sure. I think that it's also the way we typically understand depression is kind of oftentimes using a template for women because it's many times more common, let's say. So kind of the ways of kind of closing down and not engaging. I think what we found for a lot of men is that the way depression is expressed can be through anger and frustration, particularly around young men. And so I think that there's a lot more we need to understand about what does depression look like in men. As opposed to women. And I'm sure there are lots of commonalities too, but I think some of it is when we see depression, what does it look like? How do we assess it? And how is it masked by some of these coping strategies that we see men use? So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the differences in suicide rates. Is that similar in other similar countries? Or could there be a correlation between male gun ownership
It's a
that
good
leads
question.
to that huge difference?
I don't know offhand about suicide rates in other countries. Does anyone else know if it's comparable in other countries? It is. Men have higher rates, right. So,
As big a difference?
probably not 4 times, but maybe twice as high.
Right. But their gun ownership rates their suicide rate is 4 times as high, their gun ownership rate is 3 times as high.
Or much lower, right. So I think there are interesting debates about where do these differences in health outcomes come from? Is it something that's behavioral? Is it something that's related to masculinity in particular? There's a whole piece about biology that I didn't go into about differences in biology that we're learning about and that maybe we over-prioritize or over-emphasize about the ability for boys, for example, babies, male infants, to live beyond a particular point. There are more male infants born, but by the age of 8, there are more little girls in the world than little boys. And so what is that in terms of fragility of your body and what is, I guess, a little more hardwired? But I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to go down that route, but a lot of explanations are offered in that way, I guess. A lot of explanations, frameworks for understanding it.
A few decades ago, Finnish men held the highest rate of suicide, and they were also very well known for being incredibly stoic and never shared feelings. And so that was something that it's interesting if you want to go back and look like over the last 50 years where the rates were. And it may be that Finland has changed in the last few decades, and that may have had an effect. So if you're interested in the male suicide rates, I'd look at some of that literature.
Good point. Good point.
Thank you for your talk. I just sort of wanted to make an argument for maybe a nuanced take of, I guess maybe you'd call it positive masculinity, in that some of the things that you talked about, like taking responsibility, I think can lead, thinking about these things from a spiritual perspective, in the sense not specifically religious, but how one thinks of one's inward life. And so the idea of that one is responsible for others, right? So in public squares, and one of the things I've noticed, at least among men in my generation, is that there's this sense of there is an awareness of, and if you see trouble, that you're supposed to do something about it. Now, does that exact a burden? It probably does. And maybe over the course of my life, it'll take off a couple years, but that's not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing, right? And some of the, you mentioned sort of the awareness of, black and brown men being aware, sort of in their space. And I think when one sort of does these things in the right way, it can lead to tremendous sort of inward resources. And so one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of years is that my black and brown friends, more so than my white friends, with all the political changes that have happened, and some of it is just, maybe we're not as political as others, but we're more sort of like this. Even keel, where a lot of my white friends are having a really tough time. And it's not that I don't like the environment and I don't care about politics, it's just, life is life and you got to do what you got to do.
Right.
And so in some ways, looking at my white friends, I'm better equipped to handle a lot of things. And some of that goes back to issues of masculinity. And now each person, each individual has to sort of navigate that and decide what that means.
Right.
And decide what's ridiculous and stupid and toxic and harmful, but also what is enduring and endures across cultures, and across nations and across history. To be self-sacrificial is a beautiful thing in a family setting, in a community setting. And so, encouraging young men or old men to embrace that, done the right way, it only benefits you. So, the nuances and how these things play out. And I don't sort of know what the public sort of market, where we talk about these things, what that is. But I just kind of interested in your thoughts about that.
Those are excellent points. I wish we could go on about kind of that detoxifying piece, because I think there's the kind of the positive aspects of, you could call it positive psychology. You can talk about growth, personal growth. What it makes me think of is kind of these critical numbers of men who get to this point, and I go back to kind of the Million Man March and Promise Keepers happening kind of at the same time 25 years ago, and I don't think we processed a lot of it at that time, but it was this very nuanced and complicated expression of wanting to step up and take responsibility and be open to change, but doing it in kind of a sometimes kind of very patriarchal way, kind of I want to step up back into the family as a patriarch, or I want to step up and be responsible however I can be. And it became a political thing too, where I was working on the south side of Chicago with young black fathers who were picked by Clinton and Gore to come and sit on a panel and talk about being part of the Million Man March and changing their heart and stepping up for their kids and putting aside, a drug addiction or what have you. But then when you realize that behind that, it was basically relying on change. You change your heart, and the resources may not have been there, the infrastructure that you might need to kind of have a job and be there consistently and bring something to that relationship. So there's kind of a full range of things we need to think about. And it's interesting that moment kind of came and went, and a lot of us kind of carry that with us, at least of our, my age, your age maybe. Maybe we'll find after this historical moment that those are resources we have that we've developed at this time. That would be a silver lining, I think. Great points.
The examples I heard you give from research were around Black, white, and Latino men.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a body of research around Asian men and masculinity?
That's a good question. There is a limited but growing research base. A lot of it, the really wonderful stuff I'm finding is with a scholar right here at UMD. He's the chair of the Counseling Psych Department, William Liu, and he's the editor of the Journal of Psychology of Men and Masculinities. So he's writing a book on white supremacy, which is fantastic. And he's written a lot about Asian American masculinity and how men kind of cope with basically hegemonic masculinity and expectations that they face. I think it's, I think that there's incredible variation within Asian American communities, right? So a lot of times we're looking at communities that have been here for decades versus communities that are much more recent in terms of migration and refugee status and what have you. I think handling the model minority myth is a huge issue. And in that transition from kind of very traditional stoic manhood to something more open, I've seen it go both ways, where I've done some work with Korean and Korean American fathers and sons, and it turns out that sons oftentimes aspire to a more traditional way of being a man, which they think of as more Korean, where their fathers who migrated with them are much more open to kind of progressive, very flexible ways of thinking about gender and what have you. So it's interesting. I wish there was more out there. I think there's, we're kind of on the tip of an important moment in terms of diversification of a lot of our research, I hope, on masculinity. So, thanks. Good question.
Hello.
Hello.
I didn't quite know what I was coming to. But, we pass each other in the hall in the school. Right. I've heard about your work. But who would imagine that the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace would give me a chance to hear you talk? So I really want to salute you.
Thank you.
Because it's not often that I've been in a room where we're talking about these topics and it's a white man talking. Okay? So I love that. And I think you give permission to some of the other white guys. Oh, a few.
There are a few.
I think we need that kind of crosstalk. I think we actually need that more. And we need, even though we might be the choir, most good choirs I know practice. So we need to practice the pushback that we get when we walk out of this place and be okay with that. So I'm hoping this is the beginning, not an end.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Yes.
very, very much.
Thanks, Dr. Thomas.